Grace and peace be with you. We get to talk about the juicy Joseph story today, so that's some fun. But let's figure out where we are first. We're in this series we started a couple weeks ago, making this journey through the Old Testament, talking about some of these stories that show how God's promises bring us hope. God's promises bring hope. We started with Noah's promise, God's promise to Noah not to flood the earth. And then last week, Pastor Tim talked about Abraham and Sarah. And God promised them that their descendants would be blessed, that they would become a great nation, this chosen people of God, and through them, God would bless the world. They would be blessed to be a blessing. But then we get to Joseph's time, and the question starts to come about, how's God going to really do that? How can God keep that promise to use this family, these people of Israel, to bless the world to be a blessing? How can God bless them to be a blessing when things aren't going well at all? How can God bless them to be a blessing when it turns out these people are just like everyone else? Sometimes they get it right and make good choices, and other times they completely miss the mark. They get it wrong. So how is God going to keep that promise? We're working with flawed and broken people in complicated real-life situations. I really think that if you look at it this way, the whole saga of Joseph and really the rest of the Bible is God working out how to keep that promise. Is God working out how to actually bless us to be a blessing when God's working with real-life people like you and me with all of our strengths, but also all of our flaws. The Joseph story in the reading today started when Joseph was a slave in Egypt, but let's back up a little bit and remember how Joseph got there. The story of Joseph really starts in chapter 37 of Genesis with this verse 3. Now Israel, which is another name for Jacob, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. Jacob, this great father, not going to win Father of the Year because he loves one of his children, the youngest child, much more than any of the other kids, and he doesn't even bother trying to hide it. He gives this extravagant robe. Apparently, no one told Jacob that this wasn't what you're supposed to do. This doesn't a healthy family make, right? But he does it anyway. There's Jacob for you. And there's a couple things to notice about the robe. The first thing is that it shows favoritism, this fancy long-sleeve robe given to only one of the children. But also, it's the kind of outfit that you wouldn't wear doing manual labor. You're not going to go out in the field, working the fields, in a fancy long-sleeved robe that could get caught on things and tear. No, this is a manager's robe. The other brothers, Jacob's other kids, they can go out and wear jeans and a t-shirt and work in the fields, but Joe, he's got a suit because Jacob wants him to be management material. And you can imagine how this would make the brothers feel, all of this. And we hear in the next verse, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. Look at this mess that Jacob has created. Look at this toxic family environment where he's pitted his children against one another, trying to get his love and attention and affection. But actually, if you know the first part of his story, this really shouldn't surprise you. Because Jacob has shown these narcissistic tendencies already in what I would call the baby wars section of Genesis. Remember, Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, but then he got tricked into marrying her sister Leah first, and he ends up married to both sister wives, and what could go wrong with that, right? But then he shows that he loves one of them more than the other, and these two sisters have this bitter rivalry, trying to compete for his love and attention, and they do it mostly by trying to have more babies, have more heirs than the other. And during those times when they're struggling to have children, both Leah and Rachel, they give their female slave to Jacob to have some children on their behalf. In the text, we don't hear anything from Jacob. It doesn't seem like he's really bothered by this. He just takes it in stride. See, Jacob is just fine with that. He loves having this attention, loves people loving him. What does he care? what this is doing to his family, to his wives. What does he care how they feel as long as he can feel important and good? So it's not a surprise that then with his children, Jacob treats them the same way that he treated his wives and creates this toxic family environment. And that's the dysfunctional family that Joseph is born into. But Joseph doesn't help matters. Let's be real. Joseph does not help himself at all in his standing with his family. He tattles on his brothers for doing a bad job out in the field. And then he shares this dream where all of them are bowing down to the greatness of their baby brother Joseph. And they tell him, Joe, come on. Don't you see how offensive this is? Our family is already messed up. We're already dysfunctional. Do you really have to rub our noses in it and make us feel worse? And then he tells him another dream that does the same thing. It's like Joseph just can't help himself. He's so arrogant or so clueless about anyone else's feelings. He doesn't think about how telling another dream where everyone's bowing down to him would make them feel bad. So Jacob's causing problems, Joseph's causing problems, but then Joseph's brothers, they aren't saints either. They take this family drama a little bit further. They're tired of their little megalomaniac baby brother, and they decide to do something about it. The first plan was just to kill him, but Reuben talks them down, says, let's not kill him. Let's just beat him up and leave him out in the wilderness. And they do that, except that by the time they get back to check on him, Joseph's already been taken away. He's not there because he was picked up by a traveling slave trading group of Midianites who sell him to some Ishmaelites who sell him into Egypt. Now, why do we need those details? Why does it matter who picked Joseph up? Well, the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, they're actually Joseph's relatives. These were distant cousins to Joseph. Remember Abraham and Sarah, right? The patriarch and matriarch, they had a son named Isaac, and Isaac would be Joseph's grandfather. But before they had Isaac, God made them this promise that they would have these descendants, but they were old and they weren't sure if it was going to happen. And so Sarah gives her slave Hagar to Abraham, and the two of them have a son, Ishmael, whose descendants would be called the Ishmaelites. And then after Sarah dies, Abraham has another wife. There's only a couple verses about her in the Bible. You may not have even heard about Keturah, but Abraham takes another wife. Keturah has some children with her, and one of her sons is named Midian. So his descendants would be called the Midianites. So the Ishmaelites and the Midianites come from this same family tree. And by the way, good old Father Abraham, who's supposed to be this role model of faith and obedience, he's not exactly the perfect family man either. He doesn't care about splitting his family apart. He doesn't try to keep them together. He gives all of his inheritance to Isaac, the son of Sarah, and then all of his other children he sends away, including Ishmael and Midian, the sons of Hagar and Keturah. He sends them to live in the east, far away from his beloved favorite son. Now, why are we talking about all this? Why does all this family tree business matter? Don't you remember the promise? This is God's chosen family. If this is really the best that God could do, this family, they're so dysfunctional, so messed up from generation to generation. And by the time that Joseph comes around, he's such an emotionally clueless terror. His brothers beat him up and leave him in the wilderness. And then he's sold as a slave by some of his distant cousins, the Midianites and Ishmaelites. And everyone in this story so far, they're all descendants of Abraham. They're all the people who were supposed to be a great nation, who God was supposed to bless the world through them. And we're thinking, how on earth could that really happen? But the story doesn't end there. As Pastor Tim shared in the children's sermon, Joseph has these series of ups and downs. By the time he's in Egypt working in Potiphar's wife, we hear that God is still working for Potiphar. God is still with Joseph. And so Joseph rises in power because he may be emotionally clueless, but he is still a smart guy. He does end up being a good manager, and things go well under his leadership in that house. But his position there doesn't last because this unfortunate occurrence of sexual harassment in the workplace right? This woman, Potiphar's wife, has some power over Joseph, and when she doesn't get what she wants, she figures a way to have him put in prison. Another low, but we hear that God is still with Joseph in prison. And even there, he shows his good leadership skills. He becomes a manager of other prisoners. He shows his leadership and then interprets these dreams which lead him to be freed from prison, to be second in command in the Egyptian empire, second only to Pharaoh. What a rise in power. And then when he's there, some of these dreams he's interpreting show Joseph that there's going to be years of famine ahead. That could be devastating for an empire and for people. But Joseph has a plan, and Joseph comes up with this plan so that Egypt can prepare, can stock up for those years of famine. And because of Joseph's good leadership in Egypt, the entire empire and the people around it are able to survive when many more people would have starved to death during this famine. You see the good that came out of this horrible situation? After all this drama, after all of these ups and downs, this crazy, dysfunctional family, Joseph has this one line that really reframes the whole story. By the time his family are all back in Egypt, he has a little revenge of his own against his brothers, but they're all there. Joseph uses his influence and power to bring his family to safety, and his brothers start weeping. They're weeping before Joseph because they're terrified he's going to kill them. They're terrified that he's going to get revenge on them for all the horrible things that they put him through. And then Joseph says this in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended it to harm me, but God took that and made it something good. God intended it for good." And so Joseph, of course, forgave his brothers. In the end of this story, Joseph is better off. Joseph's family is better off. The people of Egypt are all better off because of Joseph, because God blessed him to be a blessing for others, despite all of the things that went wrong along the way. God can take something horrible, things that people did that were evil, that were intended for harm. God can take those and turn them into something good. That's why this story matters so much for us today. God does that all the time. God does that all the time if you have eyes to see and ears to hear. Takes evil things that people do, these messes we create, and makes something good come out of them. If you haven't heard of Malala Yousufzai, I hope you have, but if you haven't, go and Google her as soon as the service is over. Watch an interview, read her book, because she has an amazing story. But here's the short version. Malala, she was the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at 17. And as a teenager in Pakistan, was advocating for women's rights, was advocating for girls to have access to education, which was a dangerous thing to do when the Taliban was in power. And because of that, the Taliban shot her in the face, and she almost died. She spent a week in a coma, but she pulled through. And instead of being scared into silence and into hiding, actually Malala, her work and her fight for advocacy, for girls to have education around the world, it was only strengthened after this attack. She got a more powerful voice, and she keeps campaigning today. She continues to be an inspiration for people around the world who want to make this world a better place, even in the face of violence and evil like the Taliban that she knew. Now, I'm not saying that God would ever orchestrate that. God did not want the Taliban to shoot a 15-year-old girl. God didn't do that. Some evil people did that, intending it for harm, but God took that and made something good out of it. God blessed Malala so that she could be a blessing for the world. I'm sure that you can think of personal stories like this, maybe on a smaller scale. I can think of one person that I know that had a very difficult childhood. She had a hard time growing up. had some emotional and physical difficulties, and a number of other siblings. And there were times that her parents just didn't know what to do with her. And so they would lock her in the basement for days at a time, only opening the door to bring her food. And then they continued to show ways to control her when she was older, but it's enough to say that she had a hard time growing up, especially in high school and then in the few years after. But now she's doing pretty well. She has a strong faith, a deep connection to her church community, and she works as a social worker because she's used some of the experiences that she's been through to help her connect and help other people who have dealt with difficult family situations like her. And I know there are a lot of people with similar stories in helping professions like this, that part of the reason they do what they do is because of hardships they have faced themselves, and they want to do something about it. Now again, I'm not saying that God did that. It was this girl's parents who made her childhood what it was, not God. But God took that bad situation and made something good out of it, blessed her to be a blessing. In the Christian faith, there's, of course, one glaring example of this: the cross, where people did an evil thing, something that was intended for harm, and God took it and made it good. God blessed the world through that. The cross, it's easy to forget with jewelry and with beautiful things, but the cross was a terrible thing. This was an instrument of Roman torture and death, a way for the empire to keep people in line and to terrify people. And when the Romans, together with this group of religious leaders, crucified Jesus, it was a horrible, evil act. But God took it and made something good, made something great about it. The cornerstone of our faith today is because Jesus died on the cross and then rose again to show that even in the face of death, God can make something good happen. Life and love have the last word. Even in the face of death, God can redeem anything. And God blessed the world through Jesus. So the hope of this promise for us today is that no matter what you've been through, no matter what you're going through, no matter how messed up your family has been, how much you have made a mess out of things, no matter how messed up this world is that we're living in, God can still make something good out of it. God can still bless you to be a blessing for others. So may we have eyes to see and ears to hear how we can be blessed to be a blessing. Amen.